My name is Benjamin Nolo, and I'm the CEO and founder of Exodus Cry, and the director and producer of Nefarious Merchant of Souls, a documentary on sex trafficking. I think when people hear the term human trafficking, they think of movement. It connotes movement. People being moved from one place to another. And in our globalized world, that is certainly a factor that's involved, that people are moved across international borders. But we've come to realize that trafficking is not just about moving people across borders, it's about exploitation. And so in that way, slavery and human trafficking are synonymous. So there are more technical ways to define it, that it's the transportation or the harboring of individuals through means of force, fraud, or coercion, and for the purpose of some type of exploitation. But the simplest way to define human trafficking, when we ask the question, what is human trafficking? In essence, what is human trafficking? It is the exploitation of vulnerability. And so when you think about human trafficking, you think about, well, who's vulnerable? Who's being targeted for human trafficking? And there are groups of people in varying parts of the world who are marginalized for various purposes, such as statelessness. Somebody might be marginalized because of poverty. Somebody might be made vulnerable because they're an orphan, because they've been sexually abused. And so there are a number of factors that make individuals or different groups of people particularly vulnerable. And so those are the ones that are by and large the ones that are preyed upon by traffickers. Now, when you begin to break that down, well, what does that look like? It's an extremely disturbing picture. In fact, it's very, very difficult to look at, to talk about, to think about the exploitation of vulnerability and what specifically is actually happening to these millions of girls around the world. And a typical scenario would involve a girl who's first brought under the control of a pimp, of a trafficker, of a brothel owner, and there's her introduction into a life of prostitution. This is one of the most horrifying things for me that I could possibly imagine, that a woman would be forced into a lifestyle of essentially systematic rape. And so as a girl is brought into this environment, there are very systematized ways that traffickers, that pimps, that brothel owners know how to bring these women and girls under their control. And it begins with a breaking process. It begins with a breaking down of that person's soul, of that person's spirit, of that person's body, of that person's psyche. They want to completely break that individual so that they are at the mercy and under the control of whoever that trafficker might be. And the process for that involves nightmarish activities of rape and abuse and gang rape and just violence against these girls to bring them to a point of being broken. Then there's a thing in psychological terms that we talk about called traumatic bonding that happens. And when somebody has had such violence committed against them, then there's a survival instinct. It's a psychological survival instinct that emerges in which called traumatic bonding, in which now I actually begin to bond with my abuser. I begin to bond with my captor because I'm trying to survive. And in that context is when these women and girls begin to become brainwashed by their trafficker about what they're gonna do for the trafficker, about the sexual services that they're going to provide. And there's a brainwashing that occurs, and over time, these girls develop what is called Stockholm Syndrome, which is where they begin to identify with their captor. And so, in the 1800s, you might see a slave on an auction block with a ball and chain around his leg. Whereas today, that chain is psychological. And traffickers have become very sophisticated at knowing how to break down their victims, bring their victims under their control so that they can put them out on the street. And we all think, oh, well, this is just somebody who's chosen to go into prostitution to earn money the easy way. When in reality, what's happened is is she's been broken down through extreme violence, through rape, through degradation, and now is under the control and of another individual. We know because of media publicity that there is sex trafficking happening, brutal sex trafficking happening in third world countries like Cambodia, and it is awful, and we have to bring an end to it. But the reality is that it's not limited to these third world locations where there's a destabilized government, where they don't have the resources to combat it. Sex trafficking is happening in prominent, affluent countries all around the world. It's happening right here in our very own country in the United States. So for example, I live in Kansas City, and I remember hearing a story, it came out on the news. There was a trafficking bust that had occurred. And what the situation was a man who was trafficking his 14-year-old stepdaughter in these sex shops. So if you drive along the highway, you'll see a sign for like adult super center, and they sell pornography and all that kind of stuff. But some of these places have basements where, real sexual activity is going on. And this guy was trafficking his 14-year-old daughter in these sex shops right here in the Bible Belt, right in the Midwest, United States of America, and he was getting 30, 40 guys showing up at a time to rape his stepdaughter. That is human trafficking. That is sex trafficking. That is happening right here in the Midwest, in the United States. And it's not one isolated case. It's case after case after case after case. And when you look at the grand scope of slavery across the world, I mean, we're talking about, the International Labor Organization, which is very conservative estimates, is about 4.55 million people who are basically sex slaves in our world today. So this is a huge, the scope of this problem is massive. And so really the bigger question is, where isn't human trafficking happening? Where isn't sex trafficking happening? And I don't think you could find too many places around the world where it's not happening.